Hi, it's Brain Bites with me, Dr. B. Today, I'm going to be talking about serotonin and SSRIs and some of the chemical bits about how all of this works. Let's dig in. All right, so SSRIs, and especially Zoloft or sertraline, is the most prescribed medication for mental health reasons in the United States right now. SSRIs are used to treat a variety of things, but most commonly, they are used as an antidepressant or an anti anxiety medication. So, depression, anxiety, panic disorder, OCD, these are common things that the medications are used for, and some of them also are used for PTSD. Specifically today, I want to talk about serotonin and how serotonin interacts with SSRIs and with some areas of the brain and the rest of the body in general, and sort of get a little picture of depression from a more physiologic brain standpoint. So, I've been talking about SSRIs a lot, and I sort of gloss over the whole, like, oh, yeah, the serotonin thing, and it takes weeks and blah, blah, blah. And I don't really explain anything about serotonin or how the SSRIs actually work. So I'm going to get into a few of the details here today, and hopefully it will help give a more round picture of what we use these medications for, what explains some of the side effects they may have, and why it really does take so long. So let me start by just talking about a few of the changes in the brain that we tend to see with depression. So when somebody is depressed, oftentimes the neurons have weaker connections. They sort of wither up a little bit. There's not as much communication between the neurons and the different regions of the brain that are connected. The connections are not as strong, they seem weaker. So, in some areas, we see specific changes. So, with the salience network, that's an area of the brain. Some of those circuits they turn on when it's time for a task, and they turn off when you don't need to do anything in particular. And so, if there's not as much activity with the salience network, then maybe that explains why some people have trouble with the get up and go, trying to do a task, getting started and things. It's really, really difficult for people with that slowed down depression to just go out and take a walk, or why don't you just do some of your hobbies or call your friend. So there's some indication that maybe the salience network is part of the reason why people don't just do those tasks. Then the default mode network. I've talked about this before. I love this network. This is the daydreaming network. It's on when you're not doing a task that requires a lot of mental energy. But for those who have depression as well as other mental health problems, it can be a negative experience to have that downtime for the brain. So instead of doing some of that introspective sort of self reflection and feeling good about who you are, some people may ruminate or focus on all of the negativity, have a negative skew to things, negative self-talk. And so that may be one of the things that happens when those connections between circuits sort of break down. So we think the default mode network is not functioning the way that it typically would. So we know that the serotonin neurotransmitters are crucial in regulating mood and emotions and anxiety, but we know that it's probably not just the serotonin. There are a lot of different things, even those circuits that I just described, not all of that is just based on serotonin, but there are a lot of different factors that are coming into play. One of the things that we know we can target, though, is serotonin, and we can do that very specifically with certain medications. So there are different serotonin receptors, and they are in different locations of the brain, and there are some in the body as well. When we get into very specific stuff about medications and how they work, we may talk about the different kinds of receptors that they hit, like 5-HT2A or 5-HT3C. There are different receptors. For this talk, I'm not really going to get into it because I don't think it really matters that much. But there are lots of different serotonin receptors in lots of different places, and they do different things depending on where they are and what their function is. So when we're talking about the serotonin, the theory of serotonin and depression, we're talking about how in the neuron, when the serotonin is released and it's sending that message to the next neuron, the postsynaptic neuron, The serotonin that is sitting in that space in between those two neurons that's trying to send the message, there's either not enough serotonin or it's not spending enough time in that space to send the message. So that weakens the message in between these two neurons. So the neuron that's sending the message and the neuron that's receiving the message, it's not getting transmitted as strongly as it would. There's not enough serotonin to actually send the message, and the transporter that brings it back into the original cell is doing that too quickly. So we think that that's a big piece of what we see with a lot of mental illness, especially with depression. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about the serotonin in between two cells that's trying to send a signal, the two neurons. There's not enough to send that good, strong signal. Okay. And then I mentioned also there's a transporter. It is a little protein thing, and it's like a little car, and it picks up the serotonin and brings it back into the cell that just spit it out. So the cell releases the serotonin when it's trying to send the message that it needs the serotonin to send. And then those little transporters are out there. They scoop the serotonin back up and they bring it back into the cell that just released it. That way it can be released again for the next message that it sends. So that serotonin transporter, that is the target for SSRIs. So what happens when people take these SSRIs, the SSRI takes up the space on that transporter so that the serotonin can stay in that space between the cells and send that message. That way the serotonin can build up, and the stuff that's being transported by the little transporter is only the medication. The medication is just blocking that spot so the serotonin isn't leaving. So that's the purpose of this. That's how the main mechanism of how SSRIs work. So the serotonin is released, but instead of being sucked back up by the transporter, it gets to send its message to the cell behind it, the cell that is downstream that's trying to send the message to. And the transporter does not pick up that loose serotonin and bring it back into the cell. That way there's more serotonin around to send that message in a stronger, faster fashion. So we think that these medications help to just normalize the overall neurotransmission in depression and anxiety. And we think that really the serotonin has a huge part in the play of this. They've done enough research that even though there's a lot of things that are still theories and we're not sure, and there's, the more you dig down, the more little pieces you find. So they're still doing research on a lot of this. But the working idea is that, yes, serotonin is playing a big part in depression and anxiety. And it's very clear that neurons of depressed people seem to have less serotonin and more transporters. That's not a good setup. We don't want that kind of setup because that just means there's less serotonin floating around to send those messages that it needs to send. So there's also something called autoreceptors on these cells. And so they sort of pay attention to how much serotonin is out there. There are more autoreceptors when there's less serotonin. So as the serotonin builds up, the autoreceptors become desensitized, and the desensitization of the postsynaptic receptors may mediate the side effects of the medication. So when we do see these changes, we have side effects in the beginning when somebody starts a medication. Some of the reasons why it may take time is because these little autoreceptors have to become desensitized and downregulated. They already exist, so we have to wait until they break down, get reabsorbed, or the neurons notice that it's no longer needed. So that can take a little bit of time, but that period of time, it's interesting to note that that's what we're looking at when we think about side effects and how they should go away within a week or two. This is what we think may be part of the mechanism of waiting for that time for the side effects to go away. So over time, the brain may get used to the higher serotonin levels, and that can lead to a couple of different things. So there can be changes in the receptor sensitivity. So downstream signal pathways, their sensitivity changes, and that may also be part of what is taking a long time to feel the positive effects of the medication. So that's a downstream thing that has to happen. So the first action of the medication, that's great, but it has to affect a lot of other neurons in a lot of other areas. So it takes time for all of that transfer to happen, for those levels to change, for the autoreceptors to adjust, for everything to sort of get back in balance again with the new amount of serotonin that is released and available for the cells. And that desensitization may help to prevent overstimulation because we don't want too much serotonin. That can cause its own set of problems. But we need to have a balance. And this is why sometimes we're trying to tweak the medication and figure out what the right dose is. We put in one dose of medication and we wait and see what happens. Sometimes we have to go up on the dose, sometimes we have to cut it in half. And so some of the waiting time for figuring out what we're doing, we're trying to figure out what's going on with the desensitization of the neurons. And depending on the responsiveness of the serotonin system, there may be more or less serotonin receptors on a neuron. So these are things that change. They are in flux. And this is part of, the homeostasis, the body trying to keep things in balance. So it's just one of the little pieces of the puzzle where we're trying to maintain balance. It's also interesting to note, so people are aware of the fact that there are some immune factors that seem to play into depression and anxiety. So we're looking at some of these things like what is the interplay there. So there are some serotonin transporters on different immune cells. So there is an impact from SSRIs on those cells as well. So perhaps the SSRIs can also help with the inflammatory piece of depression and anxiety that we don't fully have figured out yet, but we definitely see some correlations there. And the fact that the SSRIs can help with that piece as well because of the serotonin transporters that they can block, that's also a helpful thing, we think. Another interesting thing about SSRIs is they have some antimicrobial properties. They start acting right away in the gut. The gut is an area of a lot of serotonin action, and it appears that SSRIs can influence the environment in the GI tract. So, depending on what microbes are there, it can influence the different kinds of microbes that live in the gut that cause maybe some negative things or maybe some positive things. This is another area of research that's pretty fresh, and I don't have any way to share with you all the details of that, but just knowing that SSRIs do impact that in a very real way through some antimicrobial properties, but also through just the serotonin action that happens in the gut. Another thing that applies to the time frame is just the fact that there's all these interconnected systems and circuits between the brain and the body, and a lot of things have to happen downstream. So we might make a change at one spot, but your body may not appreciate it until it gets all the way over here. So as these little changes add up and make their way downstream, you start to see more changes in other areas. So it's, again, that constant balance, but seeing how these things change from one area to another from taking this one medication that blocks this one main transporter. And those things ultimately will affect the serotonin synthesis, its release, and its reuptake. I hope you've enjoyed this today. Take this information, go forth, and I hope your brain is full of serotonin goodness. Be sure to enjoy more tasty tidbits at brainbiteswithdrb.com. Thanks.